April 29, 1945, 5:15 p.m. The rail siding outside Dachau concentration camp, Bavaria. Private First Class John Lee, 45th Infantry Division, rounds the corner of a freight depot and stops dead. In front of him stretches a train, 39 boxcars sitting motionless on the tracks. The smell hits him before his brain can process what he's seeing. It's not the smell of death he's encountered on battlefields across Europe. This is something else. Something older, more concentrated, more wrong. His squad moves forward, weapons raised, expecting ambush. Then Private Albert Prout pulls open the first cattle car door. Bodies spill out like an avalanche of bones and rags, stacked, packed, twisted together so tightly it's impossible to tell where one corpse ends and another begins. Some still have their eyes open. Others are missing limbs, gnawed by rats or other prisoners driven to madness by starvation. Roughly 2,300 dead crammed into rail cars meant for livestock. The men of the 45th Infantry have fought across Sicily, Anzio, southern France, and into Germany. They've seen friends die, seen civilians massacred, seen towns reduced to rubble. But nothing prepared them for this. Within minutes, something breaks inside these American soldiers. The rules of engagement, the Geneva Conventions, the careful discipline that separates soldiers from murderers, all of it cracks like thin ice under unbearable weight. This is the story of the Dachau Liberation Massacre, the day American GIs executed surrendering SS guards in cold blood, and how the U.S. Army struggled to answer a question that still haunts military ethics. When you walk into hell itself, do the rules of war still apply? The 45th Infantry Division, the Thunderbirds, had been driving hard toward Munich for days. By late April 1945, Nazi Germany was in its death throes. Hitler was dead or days from it, holed up in his Berlin bunker as Soviet forces closed in. American and British armies were racing across southern Germany, liberating towns where white flags hung from every window. Resistance had largely collapsed. Most German units were surrendering en masse or simply melting away. The war in Europe was effectively over, everyone knew it. But the 45th Infantry wasn't chasing retreating Wehrmacht units anymore. They'd received intelligence about a place called Dachau, a concentration camp north of Munich that had been operational since 1933, the first major camp the Nazis built, a prototype for the industrial murder that followed. Allied command wanted it secured before SS guards could destroy evidence or execute remaining prisoners. Lieutenant Colonel Felix Sparks, commanding the 3rd Battalion, 157th Infantry Regiment, led the advance elements toward Dachau on April 29th. Sparks was 27 years old, a combat veteran who'd earned a battlefield commission in Italy. He'd seen plenty of death. His men trusted him. He ran a disciplined unit, but nothing in his training manual covered what was about to happen. The first indication something was wrong came from the smell. Miles before they reached the camp, soldiers in open jeeps and half-tracks caught it on the wind, a sickly sweet stench of decay that got stronger with every mile. Some of the men gagged. Others pulled scarves over their faces. Veterans who'd been in combat since North Africa exchanged uneasy glances. This wasn't battlefield death. This was something else. As Sparks' battalion approached the camp complex around mid-afternoon, they encountered the rail siding and the death train. 39 boxcars sitting silent in the spring sunshine. Some cars had their doors partially open, revealing glimpses of what lay inside. Most were still sealed. The soldiers approached cautiously, half expecting ambush, but the only movement was flies, clouds of them, so thick they formed a black haze around the train. When they began opening the cars, grown men broke down. Private Albert Prout, the first to slide open a door, stumbled backward and vomited. Corpses tumbled out, emaciated bodies so thin that bones jutted through paper-thin skin, twisted into impossible positions from being packed so tightly. Many had died of starvation. Others from disease. Some appeared to have been shot trying to escape. A few had died so recently that their bodies were still warm. Tech Sergeant Hank Mills later described it. "I'd been in combat for 2 years, seen men blown apart, burned alive, you name it, but these weren't soldiers. These were innocent people, civilians, prisoners treated worse than animals, starved, beaten, and left to die in boxcars like garbage. Something just snapped. Word spread through the battalion within minutes. The death train, thousands of bodies, evidence of systematic murder on a scale that defied comprehension. Soldiers who'd maintained iron discipline through years of combat suddenly had murder in their eyes. Officers tried to maintain control, but the rage was contagious, spreading through the ranks like wildfire. Then they reached the camp itself. Dachau's main gate bore the infamous inscription, "Arbeit macht frei," work sets you free. A grotesque lie. Beyond the gate lay a vision of hell, filthy barracks crammed with skeletal prisoners, some too weak to stand, open latrines, watchtowers, barbed wire, and the smell, God, the smell even worse inside the camp than at the rail siding. Thousands of prisoners were still alive, staggering toward their liberators, some crying, some laughing hysterically, some too far gone to react at all. And in the guard towers and administration buildings, the SS, the Schutzstaffel, Hitler's elite paramilitary force responsible for running the concentration camps, were preparing to surrender. Some had changed into civilian clothes. Others still wore their distinctive black uniforms with lightning bolt insignia. A few had already raised white flags. Under normal circumstances, surrendering enemy soldiers are taken as prisoners of war, treated humanely per Geneva Conventions, and held for later processing. Lieutenant Colonel Sparks knew the rules. His men knew the rules. But as they walked through Dachau, past dying prisoners and corpse-filled crematoriums, past the death train and evidence of 12 years of systematic torture and murder, the rules began to feel like an obscenity. And when the first group of SS guards surrendered at the camp's southwest corner, hands raised, white flags waving, something gave way. The first executions happened within minutes of entering the camp. Private First Class Howard Buchner, a medic with the 45th Infantry who arrived in the initial wave, later testified about what he witnessed at the camp's coal yard near the southwest wall. Approximately 30-40 SS guards had surrendered to soldiers from I Company, 157th Infantry. The Germans were disarmed, lined up against a concrete wall near a coal pile, hands raised or clasped behind their heads. Some were young, teenagers pressed into service in the war's final months. Others were career SS men who'd worked at Dachau for years. An American soldier, Buchner couldn't identify him specifically, just that he was carrying a .30 caliber machine gun, set up a position with direct line of sight to the surrendered guards. No one gave an order, at least no order that was recorded or admitted later, but suddenly the machine gun opened fire. The execution lasted perhaps 10 seconds. Bodies collapsed against the wall, blood pooling on the cold dust. Some guards were killed instantly. Others writhed on the ground, wounded, groaning. Liberated prisoners watching from barracks windows cheered. Lieutenant Colonel Sparks arrived at the coal yard moments after the shooting stopped. By his own later account, he was horrified, not by the dead SS guards, but by the loss of discipline, the breakdown of military order. He found the soldier with the machine gun, later identified as Private William Curtin, and physically kicked the weapon out of his hands, screaming at him to stand down. But the damage was done, and it was only beginning. At the main guard tower near the camp entrance, another cluster of SS guards had surrendered, including Lieutenant Heinrich Wicker, a Dachau guard officer. American soldiers herded them into an open area near Tower B. Liberated prisoners were now pouring out of barracks, surrounding American troops, screaming in a dozen languages. Some pointed at specific SS guards, identifying them as particularly brutal. That one killed my brother. He beat prisoners to death. What happened next remains disputed in details but undeniable in outcome. American soldiers, exact identities mostly unknown, opened fire on the surrendered SS guards. Some used M1 Garand rifles, others used Thompson submachine guns. At least one soldier used his sidearm at close range. The firing was ragged, undisciplined, driven by rage rather than tactical necessity. Some SS guards were killed instantly. Others tried to run and were shot in the back. At least one was beaten to death by prisoners who'd seized shovels and tools from a work shed. Lieutenant Wicker was among those executed. Eyewitness accounts describe him being shot multiple times by American soldiers while his hands were raised in surrender. His body was later found with 7 bullet wounds. In total, between 35 and 50, SS guards were killed in these incidents. Exact numbers remain unclear because of conflicting testimony, destroyed records, and the chaos of the moment. Some were killed in what could charitably be called combat situations. Others were unambiguously executed while trying to surrender. Still others were beaten to death by liberated prisoners while American soldiers stood by and watched, or actively participated. Private John Lee, who discovered the death train just hours earlier, later tried to explain the mindset. "You have to understand, we just walked past 2,300 corpses in boxcars. We'd seen the gas chamber, the crematoriums, prisoners who weighed 70 pounds, medical experiments, torture devices. And these SS bastards in their pressed uniforms were trying to surrender like this was a normal war, like they were regular soldiers. They weren't soldiers, they were murderers. And at that moment, I didn't care about the Geneva Convention. I cared about justice. But it wasn't justice, not legally, not even morally by the standards the Allies claimed to be fighting for. It was revenge, raw, unfiltered, understandable, and completely illegal under military law and international conventions regarding prisoners of war." Lieutenant Colonel Sparks tried desperately to regain control. He ordered his officers to stop the killings, to secure the camp, to separate prisoners from guards, to restore military discipline. In some areas he succeeded. In others, the violence continued for hours, small-scale executions and beatings happening in isolated corners of the massive camp complex, beyond the immediate control of officers who were themselves struggling with rage and shock. By nightfall, the Dachau camp was secure. Over 30,000 prisoners had been liberated, though thousands would die in the following days and weeks, their bodies too damaged to survive even with medical care. The SS guards who'd survived the initial fury were now under heavy guard, separated from the general prisoner population and American soldiers alike. But word of the executions was already spreading. Combat photographers had captured some of it on film. Witnesses, both American and German, had seen what happened. And within the U.S. Army's command structure, a deeply uncomfortable question was beginning to circulate. What do we do when our soldiers commit war crimes while liberating a concentration camp? The answer would determine not just the fate of the men involved, but how history would remember the liberation itself, and whether the moral high ground the Allies claimed could survive contact with the hell of Dachau. Within 48 hours of Dachau's liberation, Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Whittaker, the 45th Infantry Division's Inspector General, began an official investigation. Whittaker had a reputation as a by-the-book officer, meticulous, unemotional, committed to military justice regardless of circumstances. He'd been tasked with determining exactly what happened at Dachau, who was responsible, and whether criminal charges should be filed against American soldiers for killing prisoners of war. It was a task that would have been straightforward in any other context, but Dachau was not any other context. Whittaker began interviewing witnesses immediately. The testimonies revealed a consistent pattern. American soldiers, shocked and enraged by what they discovered, had killed surrendering SS guards in clear violation of the laws of war. Some killings occurred in the heat of entry, when combat adrenaline was still high. Others occurred after guards had clearly surrendered, hands raised, weapons discarded. Several SS personnel were beaten to death by liberated prisoners, while American soldiers either watched passively or actively participated. The most damning evidence came from combat photographers and Signal Corps cameramen who documented the liberation. Photographs showed dead SS guards slumped against walls in execution-style positions. Film footage captured American soldiers herding German prisoners into groups shortly before firing broke out. Medical examiners confirmed that many of the German dead had been shot at close range or from behind, inconsistent with combat casualties, consistent with execution. Lieutenant Colonel Felix Sparks, commander of the battalion that liberated Dachau, was called to testify. Sparks didn't deny what happened. He couldn't, given the evidence, but he provided context. He described the death train, the condition of the prisoners, the years of combat that had led his men to this point. He admitted that he'd lost control of some soldiers in the immediate aftermath of discovering the camp's horrors. He also admitted to stopping the executions when he discovered them, physically intervening to prevent further killings. Sparks was careful in his testimony. He didn't justify the killings, he couldn't, legally, but he explained the psychological breaking point his men had reached. These were good soldiers, he later said, disciplined men who'd followed orders through 2 years of hell, but Dachau broke something in them. It broke something in all of us. Whitaker's investigation identified several specific soldiers allegedly involved in the killings, including Private William Curtin, the machine gunner from the coal yard incident. Witness testimony placed Curtin at the scene, operating the weapon that killed dozens of surrendered guards. Other soldiers were identified as having participated in executions near the guard towers. Still others admitted to standing by while prisoners beat SS guards to death with improvised weapons. Under the Uniform Code of Military Justice and International Law, the findings were clear. American soldiers had committed war crimes. The killings of surrendering prisoners violated Geneva Conventions, regardless of what those prisoners had done before surrendering. Intent didn't matter. Provocation didn't matter. The law was absolute. You don't execute POWs. Whitaker completed his report in late May 1945 and forwarded it up the chain of command with recommendations for courts-martial. The report landed on the desk of Major General Robert Frederick, commanding officer of the 45th Infantry Division. Frederick reviewed the evidence and faced an impossible choice. Prosecuting American soldiers for killing SS concentration camp guards would be legally correct but politically and morally complicated. The public, both military and civilian, was just beginning to learn the full scope of Nazi atrocities. Photographs and footage from Dachau, Buchenwald, Bergen-Belsen, and other camps were shocking the world. The Nuremberg trials were being organized to prosecute Nazi leadership for crimes against humanity. In this context, court-martialing American soldiers for killing SS guards felt perverse, punishing men who'd liberated death camps for losing control in the face of unimaginable horror. But ignoring war crimes committed by U.S. forces would undermine the entire moral foundation of the Allied prosecution of Nazi war criminals. How could America prosecute Germans for atrocities while excusing its own soldiers for executing prisoners? The hypocrisy would be glaring. Frederick forwarded the report to General Alexander Patch, commanding the U.S. 7th Army, without recommendation. Patch, equally conflicted, sent it up to General Jacob Devers, commander of the 6th Army Group. Devers reviewed the evidence and testimony and made a decision that would shape how Dachau's liberation was remembered. He sent the report to General George S. Patton. Patton, commanding the 3rd Army, and by this point one of America's most famous and controversial generals, had his own complicated relationship with military justice. He'd been reprimanded for slapping shell-shocked soldiers in Sicily. He'd made inflammatory public statements about the Soviets. He'd clashed repeatedly with Eisenhower over tactics and politics. But Patton had also personally toured Buchenwald just weeks earlier. He'd seen the camps. He knew what his soldiers were seeing. When the Dachau investigation report reached Patton's desk in June 1945, he read it carefully. Then he made a decision that effectively ended the inquiry. He declined to pursue courts-martial. His reasoning, never officially documented but relayed through staff officers, was blunt. The SS guards got exactly what they deserved. I won't prosecute American soldiers for doing what I would have done myself. Patton's decision was irregular. Technically, Dachau fell under 7th Army jurisdiction, not 3rd Army, but his prestige and influence were such that the matter was quietly dropped. No American soldier was ever court-martialed for the Dachau killings. Private Curtin and the others identified in Whitaker's report returned to normal duty, were eventually discharged, and went home when the war ended. The investigation report was filed away, classified, and largely forgotten for decades. But the moral question remained unresolved, uncomfortable, gnawing at the conscience of everyone who'd been there or learned about it later. Were the executions justice or murder? Were the soldiers heroes or war criminals? And if the answer was both, what did that say about the nature of war itself? The men who liberated Dachau carried what they'd seen and done for the rest of their lives. In the weeks after April 29th, as Germany surrendered and occupation duties replaced combat operations, soldiers of the 45th Infantry Division struggled to process their experiences. Some felt no remorse about the SS executions. They'd killed guards who deserved killing, full stop. Others felt profound guilt, not for what they'd done to the SS, but for losing the discipline and moral clarity they'd prided themselves on maintaining throughout the war. Still others simply shut down emotionally, refusing to discuss Dachau at all. Private John Lee, who discovered the death train, returned home to Alabama in late 1945. He never spoke publicly about Dachau for decades. His family knew he'd been there. They'd seen newspaper articles about the liberation, but he refused to discuss details. Only in the 1980s, during a Veterans Affairs counseling session, did he finally talk about what he'd seen and done. "I don't regret killing those SS bastards," he said, "but I regret that we had to. I regret that human beings created a place so evil that good men became executioners." Lieutenant Colonel Felix Sparks went on to a distinguished post-war career, becoming a Colorado Supreme Court justice. But he carried Dachau with him always. In later interviews, he was careful to neither condemn nor fully justify the executions. "War is barbaric," he said. "We try to impose rules on it, and sometimes those rules hold. But sometimes when you confront absolute evil, the rules break. I'm not proud of what happened, but I understand it. And I won't condemn the men who did it." The liberated prisoners of Dachau had their own complicated reactions to the American killings of SS guards. Most felt satisfaction, even joy, watching their tormentors receive summary justice. Many participated directly, beating guards with whatever they could find. But some survivors later expressed discomfort with the executions, feeling that they'd sullied the liberation, that revenge wasn't the same as justice. Dr. Viktor Frankl, an Austrian psychiatrist who survived Dachau, though he was actually at a subcamp during liberation, later wrote about the moral complexity in his book, Man's Search for Meaning. He argued that even in the face of Nazi atrocities, maintaining humanity and moral discipline was essential, not for the perpetrators' sake, but for the survivors' and liberators' own souls. Revenge felt satisfying in the moment, Frankl suggested, but it couldn't heal the wounds the camps had inflicted. The official U.S. Army history of Dachau's liberation, published in 1946, made no mention of the executions. The narrative presented was sanitized. American forces arrived, defeated remaining resistance, liberated grateful prisoners, and secured war criminals for prosecution. The messier reality, the breakdown of discipline, the revenge killings, the participation of liberated prisoners in summary executions, was omitted entirely. This sanitized version held for decades. It wasn't until the 1980s and 1990s, when veterans began speaking more openly and classified documents were declassified, that the full story emerged. Historians like Howard Buchner, the medic who'd witnessed the Coal Yard Massacre, published accounts based on eyewitness testimony and recovered documents. Journalists interviewed surviving veterans. Slowly, the complex truth replaced the simplified myth. The revelation sparked debate. Some argued that exposing American war crimes, even ones committed against SS concentration camp guards, was important for historical honesty and moral consistency. Others felt that focusing on the executions diminished the broader truth of Nazi atrocities and unfairly tarnished the reputation of soldiers who'd liberated death camps. Still others argued it demonstrated the corrupting nature of war itself, that even just causes and righteous anger couldn't prevent good men from committing atrocities when pushed beyond human limits. Legal scholars have wrestled with the Dachau executions ever since. By any objective standard, the killings violated the laws of war. But can law account for the psychological impact of discovering industrialized genocide? Should soldiers who witnessed the death train and the camp's horrors be held to the same standards as soldiers in conventional combat? And if the law cannot bend for Dachau, does that make it just, or merely rigid? General Patton's decision to bury the investigation prevented these questions from being tested in military courts. Whether that was an act of compassion for traumatized soldiers or a cynical cover-up of war crimes depends largely on one's perspective. What's undeniable is that Patton understood the political and moral impossibility of prosecuting American liberators while simultaneously prosecuting Nazi perpetrators. The survivors of the 45th Infantry Division held regular reunions for decades after the war. At these gatherings, Dachau was rarely discussed in detail. It was too painful, too complicated, too morally ambiguous. But in private conversations, veterans would sometimes acknowledge what happened. "We became what we were fighting against just for a few minutes," one veteran admitted years later. "We became executioners. The difference is we stopped. They never would have." By the 21st century, most of the men who liberated Dachau were gone. The last survivors passed away in the 2000s and 2010s, taking their first-hand memories with them. What remains are documents, photographs, testimonies, and the enduring moral question they left behind. When you encounter absolute evil, when every instinct screams for vengeance, when the rules seem obscene in the face of what you've witnessed, what do? The American soldiers at Dachau answered that question one way. History continues to argue about whether they were right. The Dachau Liberation Massacre remains one of World War II's most morally complex moments, a case study in the collision between law, justice, and human psychology under extreme stress. From a purely legal standpoint, the case is clear-cut. The American soldiers who executed surrendering SS guards committed war crimes. The Geneva Conventions make no exceptions for provocation, no matter how extreme. Surrendering combatants must be taken as prisoners and treated humanely. Summary execution is illegal, full stop. By this standard, the soldiers who killed at Dachau violated international law and should have faced courts-martial. But law exists in theory. Humans exist in reality. The soldiers who walked into Dachau on April 29, 1945, had spent years fighting their way across Europe. They'd seen friends die, civilians massacred, cities destroyed. They'd been trained to kill enemy soldiers in combat, to follow orders, to maintain discipline even under fire. But nothing in their training prepared them for Dachau. Nothing could have. Psychologists who have studied combat trauma and moral injury describe what happened at Dachau as a catastrophic failure of cognitive frameworks. The soldiers' understanding of war, brutal but governed by rules, fought between combatants for strategic objectives, collapsed when confronted with evidence of systematic genocide. The SS guards weren't enemy soldiers in any meaningful sense. They were functionaries of industrialized murder. And the instinct to extend Geneva Convention protections to them felt, in that moment, like a betrayal of their victims. Military ethicists remain divided. Some argue that the law must be absolute, that once you start making exceptions, even for SS concentration camp guards, you've undermined the entire framework that separates lawful combatants from war criminals. Others argue that the law must account for human psychology, that soldiers pushed beyond normal human experience cannot be held to peacetime standards of conduct. There's also the question of selective prosecution. The American military prosecuted its own soldiers for war crimes throughout WWII, rapes, murders of civilians, theft, abuse of prisoners. But those prosecutions focused on acts that served no military purpose and reflected personal criminal behavior. The Dachau executions were different. They were acts of rage and revenge triggered directly by confronting Nazi atrocities. Prosecuting them would have required acknowledging that American soldiers, in the very act of liberating concentration camps, had become war criminals themselves. General Patton's decision to bury the investigation was pragmatic but problematic. It spared traumatized soldiers from prosecution, but it also created a precedent that some war crimes could be excused based on emotional circumstances. The Nuremberg trials, beginning just months later, prosecuted German defendants who claimed they were just following orders or had been traumatized by their wartime experiences. The prosecutors rejected those defenses. How then could American prosecutors excuse their own soldiers on similar grounds? The answer is that they couldn't, at least not publicly. So the Dachau executions were buried, classified, kept out of official histories until decades later when the legal and moral questions they raised couldn't damage Allied credibility in prosecuting Nazi war criminals. What does Dachau teach us about war, justice, and human nature? First, that the rules of war are fragile. They depend on shared understanding and mutual restraint. When one side abandons all restraint, When they build death camps and pack 2,300 people into cattle cars to die, the other side's commitment to rules becomes psychologically untenable. The soldiers who executed SS guards weren't sociopaths. They were normal men who'd been pushed past the breaking point. Second, that justice and law are not always the same thing. The executed SS guards were guilty of monstrous crimes. They deserved punishment. But summary execution by enraged soldiers wasn't justice. It was revenge. Real justice would have been prosecution, trial, and lawful punishment. The fact that the executions felt satisfying to many observers doesn't make them right. Third, that moral absolutism often fails when confronted with absolute evil. It's easy to condemn the Dachau executions from the comfort of distance, 7 decades removed, sitting in safety, not having walked past 2,300 corpses or seen prisoners who'd been tortured and starved for years. But would any of us in that moment have maintained perfect discipline? Would we have extended Geneva Convention protections to the people who built the death train? The uncomfortable truth is that the American soldiers at Dachau were both liberators and executioners, heroes and war criminals, justified and guilty, all at once. They freed 30,000 prisoners from hell. They also killed dozens of surrendering men in violation of international law. Both things are true. Both things matter. General Patton understood this paradox. When he read the investigation report and decided to bury it, he wasn't excusing war crimes. He was acknowledging that war, especially war against an enemy as monstrous as Nazi Germany, creates moral situations that peacetime law cannot adequately address. He chose to prioritize the soldiers' humanity over legal absolutism, believing that prosecuting traumatized men for acts of rage, committed, while liberating death camps would serve no purpose except to salve abstract legal principles at the cost of concrete human suffering. Was he right? History still argues. What we know for certain is this: Dachau was hell on earth, built and operated by human beings who'd abandoned every moral constraint. The American soldiers who liberated it were traumatized by what they found, and some responded with illegal violence against the camp's guards. General Patton chose to protect those soldiers from prosecution, prioritizing their psychological welfare over legal consistency. And the entire episode remains buried in moral ambiguity, a reminder that even the most just wars involve good people doing terrible things, and that the distance between hero and war criminal can sometimes be measured in seconds, in the time it takes to pull a trigger while staring at 2,300 corpses in boxcars. The rules of war exist for good reasons, but Dachau showed that those rules rest on assumptions, that combatants will observe basic human decency, that war will be terrible but comprehensible, that soldiers won't encounter evil so absolute it shatters their moral frameworks. When those assumptions fail, the rules become first difficult, then impossible, and finally obscene. The American soldiers at Dachau learned that lesson in the worst way imaginable, and history has never quite decided what to do with that knowledge. This story represents one of the most morally complex moments in American military history, a collision of justice, vengeance, law, and human psychology that still challenges us today. If this deep dive into the untold and uncomfortable truths of WWII resonated with you, subscribe to WWII Ember. We're committed to exploring the stories that don't fit into simple narratives, the moments that force us to confront difficult questions about war, morality, and what it means to be human under impossible circumstances. Hit that like button, drop your thoughts in the comments, especially on this one. Where do you stand on the Dachau executions? Were the soldiers justified? Should they have been prosecuted? There are no easy answers, but the conversation matters. Let's keep history honest, even when it's uncomfortable.